Canada looks stable from the outside, but underneath there are cracks most Americans would never believe. Three companies, Rogers, Bell, and TELUS, control over 90% of Canada's telecom market. In July 2022, that concentration became impossible to ignore. A network upgrade at Rogers triggered a cascading failure that left more than 12 million Canadians without cell service or internet for over 15 hours. The outage didn't just silence phones. Payment terminals using Interac stopped working nationwide. People couldn't buy groceries, fill prescriptions, or pay for transit. Emergency 911 calls failed to connect, and in some cities, ambulance response times stretched 60% longer than normal. Banks, hospitals, and government services ground to a halt. For many, it felt like the country had lost its digital pulse. In the United States, dozens of carriers compete, and most regions have built-in redundancy. In Canada, a single point of failure proved enough to paralyze daily life. The Rogers blackout exposed a hidden choke point, one that left essential services at the mercy of a handful of corporate networks with little backup and few alternatives. Grocery stores in Canada operate on a razor-thin margin of inventory. Chains like Loblaw, Sobeys, and Metro account for about 70% of the national grocery market. Their shelves are stocked using just-in-time logistics, with most stores holding only 2 to 3 days' worth of food. When COVID-19 hit in 2020, panic buying emptied aisles across the country. Staples like flour, meat, and canned goods vanished in hours, and frozen food sales spiked by 30%. The system designed for efficiency struggled to keep up with even a brief surge in demand. In the summer of 2024, the Vancouver port strike stalled over 300,000 shipping containers, delaying everything from produce to packaged goods. Distribution centers scrambled, but bottlenecks rippled across the country. Unlike the United States, where grocery chains often keep 5 to 7 days of stock and can reroute shipments through multiple ports, Canada's supply chain has fewer alternatives. The fragility isn't theoretical, it's been exposed by recent shocks. A single port closure or trucking disruption can leave entire regions waiting for restocks. For a country that relies so heavily on imports and long-distance freight, the margin for error is frailty and vanishingly small. Nearly every prescription filled in Canada depends on a supply chain that crosses oceans and borders. 95% of the country's medications are imported, arriving from factories in the United States, Europe, India, and China. Unlike telecom or groceries, there is no single company in control, yet the entire system runs on invisible threads that can snap without warning. In 2020, a global shortage of antibiotics left 1 in 8 Canadian pharmacies unable to fill basic prescriptions. That year, parents searched for children's medications as shelves sat empty for weeks. The vulnerability runs deeper than any one crisis. Most Canadian drug wholesalers negotiate for the lowest possible prices, relying on rebates that reward bulk imports over domestic production. This makes it uneconomical to manufacture even essential drugs at home. By contrast, the United States covers about 45% of its pharmaceutical needs with domestic plants. In Canada, there are just 2 large-scale facilities capable of producing finished medicines, and neither can meet national demand in an emergency. If a major border closed or a trade dispute erupted, pharmacies would face shortages within days. The supply chain's efficiency comes at the cost of resilience, leaving millions dependent on a system with almost no slack. Stretching from Windsor to Quebec City, a narrow band along the southern border is home to nearly 90% of Canada's population. This corridor, less than 100 miles wide in most places, contains 3 out of every 4 pieces of critical infrastructure: hospitals, data centers, power plants, and major highways, packed into a strip that runs parallel to the United States. Planners have warned for decades that this concentration creates a single front of exposure. In a country of almost 4 million square miles, most people and assets are clustered within a day's drive of the border. By contrast, the United States spreads its population and infrastructure across a much broader area, with only about 55% living within 100 miles of any border. In Canada, a disruption to this southern spine, whether from a natural disaster, cyber attack, or border closure, could affect the daily lives of tens of millions in a matter of hours. The country's economic engine, energy grid, and emergency response networks all depend on this densely packed zone. One map, circulated among federal risk analysts, shows a single shaded band, thin but vital, where a single event could ripple across the entire nation. The pattern is clear. Canada's stability rests heavily on a demographic and infrastructure cluster that leaves little room for error. Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Kansas City move nearly all the country's freight. Together, these two companies own about 95% of Canada's rail track and control the routes that connect ports, prairie farms, and urban centers. Every day, they carry more than 80% of the nation's cargo, including grains, fuel, chemicals, building materials, and medical supplies, across 27,000 miles of track. In October 2022, a threatened strike at CN brought the system to the edge. Negotiations stalled, and federal intervention barely averted a shutdown that would have halted 4 out of 5 freight cars in the country. The risk wasn't just economic. Railways move about 70% of Canada's heating fuel and 60% of hospital goods. A stoppage, even for a few days, could leave remote communities without fuel in winter or delay critical medical shipments. Unlike the United States, which has 7 major freight railroads and dozens of regional lines, Canada's network relies almost entirely on these two giants. There are no alternate routes for cross-country cargo. When CN or CP slows, the entire supply chain feels it, with food, medicine, and fuel all moving at their pace. This duopoly is efficient in normal times, but creates a single point of failure that few outside the country ever see. Every Canadian winter, temperatures plunge to minus 30 degrees Celsius or lower across much of the country. In these conditions, heat is not a comfort, it is survival. 85% of Canadian households rely on delivered fuels like natural gas, propane, or heating oil. For many, this lifeline arrives by truck or rail, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles from refineries or storage depots. The system works smoothly in good weather, but it leaves little room for error. In January 2023, a supply disruption in Manitoba left 12% of homes without heating fuel for nearly 2 days. Residents scrambled to find space heaters or shelter with neighbors as indoor temperatures dropped below freezing. For seniors and families with young children, the risk turned immediate. Hospitals prepared for a surge of cold exposure cases, and emergency shelters filled overnight. The outage traced back to a combination of mechanical failures and weather-delayed rail shipments, reminders of how tightly fuel delivery is linked to Canada's vast geography and harsh climate. A similar story played out in Texas during the 2021 freeze, where power and heating failures put 13 million people at risk. But Canada faces this test every winter, with far fewer backup options. In a country where winter can kill, the reliability of fuel delivery is a matter of life and death. Emergency rooms in Canada routinely report wait times of 12 hours or more, even outside crisis periods. The country maintains just 2.2 hospital beds per 1,000 residents, about 40% fewer than the United States. Intensive care units reached 95% capacity at the peak of the 2020 pandemic, leaving almost no room for a surge. Per capita, Canada spends roughly 30% less on healthcare than its southern neighbor, a gap that translates into fewer staff, fewer beds, and longer delays. For patients, this means that a sudden spike in demand, whether from a severe flu season, a supply chain disruption, or a major accident, can overwhelm hospitals within days. The system's efficiency, celebrated in normal times, becomes a liability when every bed is already full and every minute counts. Across Canada, the water flowing from taps depends on a network of pipes, most of which were buried before 1970. 70% of municipal water mains are now more than half a century old, and nearly a fifth date back to the 1950s. The rate of replacement lags far behind the pace of decay. On many reserves, the problem is even more acute. 33 Indigenous communities remain under boil water advisories, some for decades, despite repeated federal promises. Canada spends just 40 cents per person on water infrastructure for every dollar spent in the United States. When a main ruptured in February 2025, over 200,000 people relied on bottled water for weeks. As the Minister of Indigenous Services put it, clean water is not a luxury, it's a basic human right. The aging, underfunded system leaves millions at risk, one break or contamination away from crisis. A single shock, whether cyber attack, rail stoppage, or border closure, can ripple across every system at once. The Chief of Canada's Emergency Management Agency describes the scenario. Telecoms go dark, freight halts, heating fuel stalls, hospitals overflow, and water runs short. In hours, daily routines unravel into a national emergency, with consequences reaching far beyond Canada's borders. Canada's stability depends on a handful of companies, fragile logistics, and infrastructure concentrated along one border. Compared to the US, this tight coupling means a single disruption can cascade nationwide. In a world of rising shocks, resilience isn't a given. It's a choice Canadians must confront. Share your thoughts below.